As the culture war rages on, it's worth it to have a bit of a broader view and to place, sort of this time and place in its proper context of culturally, you know, uh, what's going on. Not just, I want to point at things that are happening on the other side of the culture war um, that are going unnoticed, essentially. I don't know specifically about other countries, but I imagine they're roughly the same as my country in terms of national holidays. There are national holidays of gender violence. There are national holidays of Women's Day, which is essentially used to usually conglomerate all the special troubles that women, so it's sort of Women's Day supposedly partially represents, breast cancer, all issues that just pertain to women that awareness needs to be garnered around, or something like that. I specifically first mentioned, a national holiday for gender violence, gender-based violence, is because um, this style of activism which I rail against. I personally find it very unhealthy, psychologically unhealthy for the population. It is one thing to bring focus to a problem, but what is the point of such activism, of such general grievance cultivating activism, when the solution to these problems is not what the day is about, merely emphasizing, underscoring, and underlying the prevalence of it? The point of these holidays, I believe, almost psychologically, they serve to entrench identity consciousness, they serve to embolden association, fealty, allegiance with one's identity, baked into the hard crust of narcissistic injury, which is being cultivated through this kind of activism. Where, why don't we have a public holiday based on harmonious gender relations or something like that, in terms of actually dissecting and deconstructing the supposed problems, or the catalytic things that generate these problems, like actually tackling the generation of these problems rather than just merely weighing the effect, weighing the outcome, which to my mind complicates the issue by making treating the real cause of problems politically uh, impossible, or culturally, um, because essentially, if you blame the victim, as it were, then you're not actually uh, uh, underscoring the purport of the day properly, because the day is properly named after the problem, not after the solution, or not after the model of the solution. So it's weird that essentially we focus so much on the hurt, the problems, the narcissistic injury, and it becomes impossible to actually grapple with the issue realistically, pragmatically. That becomes politically costly, or culturally effectively impossible, as we entrench this culture of cultivating and celebrating narcissistic injury, which is measured in how victimized is your identity, how victimized is some category or something like that. And that is the key and the conduit towards amplifying one's voice, or that becomes the banner that you march under in order to be saved from the system. Now, another thing that I have, I mean, I was never interested in the artist called Pink. Um, I remember there was I had a peer in my high school who always liked how Pink was a rebel, how she was punk, and she was perhaps the only well-known sort of punk symbol or something like that. And what was punk supposed to mean? Punk was supposed to be sort of edgy and authentic and politically aware and somewhat left-wing. Uh, uh, to some degree, or anti-disestablishment. Uh, Sorry, no, just anti the establishment, essentially. Um, Now, I I've always thought, Pink is just, well, especially she has proven herself, at least in the modern era, to be just as sort of mindless as any common sort of democratic supporting so-called liberal, but actually proto-fascist. And I want to read out one of the lyrics of uh, I think it's a relatively new song by Pink, called "What About Us." I'm just going to read through those lyrics, and I'm just going to explain essentially how this is distinctly proto-fascist. Um, it is all it is addressed. It is like a love letter addressed to the true savior of the identity. That what is specifically being addressed in the lyrics of this song is it's speaking to who will be the guardian of the identity, who will stand up for the identity consciousness, effectively, is the great theme of this song. Um, and to me, it's quite disgusting how it galvanizes uh, sentiment that is profusely anti uh, liberal values, and a liberal, a classical liberal ethos, is just completely thrown under the bus, is just completely eviscerated, and how surreal and delusional the whole thread of these lyrics are. Okay, so I'm not going to read. There's just the beginning that says la da 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 da. Uh, I'm just going to start from the words, and the whole thing is just words. After that beginning part, we are searching. We are searchlights we can see in the dark. We are rockets pointed up at the stars. We are billions of beautiful hearts, and you sold us down the river too far. What about us? What about all the times you said you had the answers? What about us? What about all the broken happy ever afters? What about us? What about all the plans that ended in disaster? What about love? What about trust? What about us? We are problems that want to be solved. We are children that need to be loved. Uh, uh, I'll just continue. I'll comment at the end. We were willing, we came when you called, but man, you fooled us. Enough is enough. Oh, what about us? What about all the times you said you had the answers? What about us? What about all the broken, happy ever afters? What about us? What about all the plans that ended in disaster? Oh, what about love? What about trust? What about us? Oh, what about us? What about all the plans that ended in disaster? What about love? What about trust? What about us? Sticks and stones, they may break these bones, but then I'll be ready. Are you ready? It's the start of us waking up. Come on. Are you ready? I'll be ready. I don't want control. I want to let go. Are you ready? I'll be ready. 'Cause now it's time to let them know we are ready. What about us? What about us? What about all the times you said you had the answers? So what about us? What about all the broken happy ever afters? Oh, what about us? What about the plans that ended in disaster? Oh, what about love? What about trust? What about us? Now, the I mean, this is overtly fascist. Um, I mean, it literally infantilizes who this song is for. So the song is for an audience that we are children that need to be loved. We were willing, we came when you called, but man, you fooled us. Enough is enough. I mean, this is exactly the kind of complaint that was in the Nuremberg rallies, the Weimar rallies. That people didn't want to be citizens anymore. They didn't want to be citizens of a republic. They didn't want to be tasked with the kind of political responsibility of effectively being accountable for the government that they enjoyed or didn't enjoy. That they wanted their identity to be infantilized. They wanted to be catered to and pandered to like children. Sorry, I'm just trying to find that other thing. I don't want control, I want to let go. Are you ready? I'll be ready. It, sorry, I'm reading this slightly out of order. And above that it says, it's the start of us waking up. Come on, are you ready? I'll be ready. I don't want control, I want to let go. Are you ready? I'll be ready. Because now it's time to let them know we are ready. What about us? So, I mean, again, it's always the collective. What about us? It's not, what the individual is lost. And to give up control. It's it's frightening just how patently fascistic this creed is by Pink. Um, uh, so I mean, where all liberal pretenses have melted away and given themselves up and precipitated very clearly the fruit of this kind of narcissistic injury that is both perpetually cultivating this narcissistic injury um, through the vehicle and the conduit of a collective identity that then assumes not only the source of moral consideration, but essentially it is representation only of these categories of identity that become the only valid political um, mover or agent and or entity. And so I don't want control. Are you ready? I want to let go. I'll be ready. What about us? So the individual must just be ready. Because what about us? And, I just wanted to say that what in these lyrics, the Pink song What About Us, I think shows culturally the movement from cultivating narcissistic injury, from having Women's Day and Gender-Based Violence Day, and that kind of grievance activism, where activism is used as a disgusting and decrepit, flailing excuse to brazenly indulge in I don't want control, I want to let go, what about us? I mean, it's amazing how just explicitly, I mean, I would even call it proto-fascist, because not only is this message fascist, but it is directly designed to move people along the the conveyor belt, the the manufacturing of consensus. Um, the consolidation of this disgusting um, proto-fascist creed in what is who is being addressed in this song. Only the representative of the identity, only the true guardian of the identity. And in some sense, it does so by narcissistically complaining that the current guardian of the identity has failed. That it addresses someone that frankly does not exist. It says, uh, we are the problems that want to be solved. We are children that need to be loved. We were willing. We came when you called. Who is she talking about? Who is she talking in relation to? But man, you fooled us. Enough is enough. Who fooled who? The current leader of the identity sect, the current priests of identity consciousness. I mean, who is she? Which Führer is she? Because she's basically saying, we have a false Führer, we need a true Führer, we need a true savior of the identity. We need a new father of the identity, because the old father uh, fooled us. So I mean, it's weird because I would say that this is the overtly strange and surreal premise of this song, which is that in some sense the whole Führer religion, the proto-fascist moral consciousness, is so obscure and surreal that it has to somewhat invent the myth that it always was in effect, that it was always operative, but simply it was never responsibly executed. It was never responsibly um, actualized. And so, it's sort of like it's been subverted and betrayed. Usually, is usually the thing about you have to create conspiracies like the Jewish conspiracy, or like the conspiracy of white male privilege or white privilege, or in my country, uh, we have overtly the black fascistic um, rhetoric and jargon, around white monopoly capital. Um, Normalizing a whole slew of overtly fascistic politics. I wonder if the Genocide Watch has, with all of this, sort of anti, uh, with the corruption the the corruption commission around Jacob Zuma, and how Zuma is leveraging all of his support um, uh, and this cabal of racialist politics driven, because I mean that's how you always defer corruption and divert pressure from corruption, is that you just use your convenient scapegoat, you use your convenient mythology, essentially, um, that takes the. I mean, this is how corrupt African countries have always functioned, is that they have functioned using divisive politics, because that is how you um, disguise corruption, is that you create melodrama around a scapegoat. You create factional, illiberal, regressive politics. In yeah, uh, I mean, this is why Africa has always had such corrupt administration. It's the general theme in Africa. As to why it has developed so slowly and badly, is essentially because of tribal, sectarian, racial factionalism, and essentially the dismantling, or at least the antithesis, of functioning. Uh, I mean, if you don't sort of vote out corrupt governments uh, because you're too busy essentially entrenching cultural hegemony, or political hegemony, being a cover for you know, a weird kind of political patronage, that the state is essentially just a kind of organized crime, a kind of organized mafia centered around patronage. And that patronage is just kind of weirdly normalized and organized around. I mean, it's interesting. There's a variant of this that happens in American politics in terms of the establishment. Um, because effectively they have whittled down democracy into a neat duopoly. And so, in the same way that many people have argued that there's no real competition when you have a duopoly, you end up with the pretense of competition where it's just um, two competitors that are basically colluding um, de facto in terms of stabilizing prices and such. Anyway, which is essentially what happens when you have such large scale enterprises, um, which are only made sort of cost effective because of essentially the kind of red tape, the kind of license structures, and being able to burden the cost of overheads better. And essentially, the biggest driver of overhead costs is essentially um, legal and state mandates of compliance with regulation and other such things. It's worth pointing out that all the climate stuff and all the environmental stuff is often pitched on this sort of level as well as what about us and collective guilt and collective shame, and essentially kind of also just generally amping up the pressure of a kind of narcissistic injury um, to then be funneled into the more specific trends and the more specific conduits of essentially abrogating that blame towards identity factions and empowering other identity factions that already had a beef with those identity factions. So, I mean, it is perhaps worth pointing out that, I mean, I do think that the environment is under severe pressure, mainly from pollution, of which carbon emissions are not a pollutant. It is worth pointing out, I think, at every opportunity, the kind of propaganda around climate change. The climate is certainly changing because we're exiting the Little Ice Age, uh, but uh, the climate has always changed. I mean, the collapse of Egyptian agriculture uh, sort of roughly 2,000 years ago, um, that was a huge climate change. I mean, the climate has always changed, and quite frankly, in recent history, the climate has been much more mild than it usually has because of the Little Ice Age. Um, and obviously, this compounded with essentially just generally threatening the health of biomes and of the planet, especially the health of the seas, is certainly not good. And the kind of pollution that we have in the seas. And I would say that generally, this obsession with carbon emissions is a huge diversion from actually doing real important environmental and ecological work around pollution. That the pollution stuff has taken a huge back seat to the boogeyman of carbon emissions. And it's actually probably good that we have extra carbon in the air. Um, when carbon gets down so low, it actually makes it harder for plants to grow. And, and let me just also, what I would, the current evidence for carbon driven uh, increase of temperature is really very weak. It's almost no evidence at all. And the evidence that I would make for this counterclaim is that if you actually listen to the polymaths, if you actually listen to the man who designed the computer models that are used to make all the climate model predictions, he says that his modeling system that he invented, that he literally designed that kind of computer modeling, he says it's being misused, that how it's being abused by these people who are throwing in these numbers is just, it's fantasy. And they can kind of get away with it because climate is so complicated and misunderstood that you can just it's like throwing darts at something. I mean, like, but on the face of it, the correlation between carbon and temperature is, quite frankly, such a minuscule. Uh, it's so terribly insignificant. Like CO2 itself is not a strong greenhouse gas. If anything, I believe methane is so much more potent um, as a contributing greenhouse gas. CO2 is just such an unimportant greenhouse gas, combined with the fact that it actually makes plants grow better, that you would think that, if anything, it probably has an ameliorative effect. It's probably one of those negative feedback triggers in term. It probably, in excess of CO2 would probably bring us more towards homeostasis. And the average level of CO2 in the planet is much higher. If you look at the ice core samples and you look at the levels of CO2, apart from going through a little ice age, which hasn't been good, and our CO2 is actually, at the world average, is just incredibly low. We don't have enough CO2. Really, we don't. Um, I think Alex Jones makes this point. It's amazing how many things Alex Jones is explicitly correct about, and how it's derided and overlooked, essentially because it's amazing how this scientific consensus, how it gets absorbed in through buzzwords and through movies and through basic concepts. Essentially because the forerunner of essentially the myth around climate science was developed through movies that had the world becoming an ice wasteland, because that's the whole thing, is that it gets hot before it gets incredibly cold and becomes a frozen tundra. That because of that uh, uh, sort of counterintuitive engrossing, it's this weird kind of cultivation that essentially, if you give to people a rather basic counterintuitive idea, then you've empowered them to see beyond the simpletons and the simple perspective, and therefore uh, uh, you embolden people to essentially be able to believe the lie because it's been repeated enough, and because it's been normalized, and because essentially it can be seen as a kind of as an intellectually elite a sort of intellectual mark of sort of special proficiency, um, and it's weirdly very similar to the kind of narcissistic injury um, that is indulging in this kind of projective um, sort of fifth generational warfare. And I just wanted to point out that we're talking in the culture war, they're talking a lot about sort of fifth generational warfare, but I just want to point out, I mean, I guess it's already known just how much culture, but not just um, obviously these elites, like these music elites and things like that, and celebrity elites that pander these messages. is one thing, but I just wanted to link it with the national holidays. I thought that's at least, in terms of giving tacit cultural support to these kinds of vacuous activists who aren't interested in solutions but are merely interested in engrossing themselves in, sort of cultivating the grievance and using it as a cultural bulwark and an entrenched power sort of insignia that then they can brand onto their legion of following as in some sense as a substitute for um, purpose and community. It's just that purpose and community is somewhat has a much lower threshold, a much lower standard of developing um, a, a a platform for itself, because it doesn't try to create an independent a positive structure of value. It's built on devaluing the oppressor, the systemic um, deficiency. It's built on criticism. It's built on a negative devaluation of what other people have supposedly imposed and impinged. So in some sense, it's a defensive maneuver, which is a theme that comes out so strongly in this Pink song. That it's contrasted as a necessary reaction. It is reactionary politics at its core, and that is essentially what at least what punk has ended up precipitating out of, or at least in the case of Pink. And it's interesting because, I mean, the only sort of true people that I would say that embody the spirit of punk, are these very few authentic artists who actually do have a positive message, who actually do um, have a real sense of individualism and self-directed um, agency and self-determinism. Those artists who essentially, um, quite frankly, endorse the views of people like Candace Owens. Um, who essentially are capable of saying, not we are the problem that want to be solved, but I am the problem. We are the problems that want to be solved. Rather, it places that locus in the individual sphere of empowerment, rather than defining yourself as a special case or class of betrayed victim um, that can only reclaim your power through some kind of bestowed identity pride, or rectified identity um, sort of cultural contingent. Um, just trying to find, where was this other line in this song that talked about, it's right at the beginning. We are rockets pointed up at the stars. We are searchlights we can see in the dark. And Oh, okay. So I'm reading this. Let me read it in order. We are searchlights we can see in the dark. We are rockets pointed up at the stars. We are billions of beautiful hearts, and you sold us down the river too far. What about us? And then the chorus is, what about us? But that, I mean, that's exactly the vision of citizens and people that the Nazis had. Is it as if they are addressing the, I mean, this, identity politics is essentially exactly like fascism, um, Nazi philosophy. If you just replace genetic superiority with moral superiority that is inherited through your group, through your identity, um, that essentially the myth of blood and soil gets replaced by the myth of collective social justice and social guilt. That essentially it's a more esoteric way of deriving a form of superiority, which has simply been traded from the kind of the Darwinistic genetic superiority with um, the more esoteric moral superiority, um, which belongs to your faction. Um, but I just want to point out how surreal this is. We are searchlights we can see in the dark. We are rockets pointed up at the stars. It's kind of like the promise of the thousand-year Reich. Uh, and you sold us down the river too far. Who the hell are they talking about? Who the hell is this song addressed to, if not the spirit of the Führer? They're talking to authority. They're saying, well, authority, you need to be a Führer. The authority, the only true authority is the spirit of the Führer. And therefore, we have been sold down the river too far. And we need the political authority to speak for we who are rockets pointed up at the stars. We are searchlights we can see in the dark. So that we can see who is truly representing the spirit of the Führer. Is that not the basic undertone of this whole song? Anyway, it is a very useful song in that I think it specifically captures the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, the proto-fascist, so-called left-wing, so-called liberal side of the political aisle. They're kind of mindless drivel and sort of moral pretentiousness. And the kind of overt, I mean, there's a lot of violence encoded into these lyrics. Sticks and stones, they may break these bones, but then I'll be ready. Are you ready? It's the start of us waking up. Come on, are you ready? I'll be ready. I don't want control, I want to let go. Are you ready? I'll be ready. So sticks and stones, they may break these bones, but then I'll be ready. Are you ready? I mean, I guess I when I see these things encoded into culture, living in South Africa, it's certainly. I mean, this is. I mean, especially in terms of in South Africa, I do believe that, if you don't like what's happening in South Africa, vote for a different political party. That would be change your vote. Have you considered changing your vote? Essentially, that is how you solve things in a democracy. Um, if you don't like the general conditions in a society, and you think that it's structurally unstable or unsuitable or something like that, uh, have you voted for the same party? Um, or at least are you voting for a party that symbolizes a different policy or management style or something like that than the one that's in power? And essentially this dislocation, that essentially people can have their rancid politics and essentially indulge in this kind of very deeply flawed kind of pontification on the level of sort of talking about the themes of politics through identity consciousness and identity categorization of politics, that you end up simplifying reality um, in a way in which it becomes completely intractable in terms of how any of the problems ever get uh, treated. And in some sense, I think that the conceptual intractability of it lends it to the idea that you've got a kind of an infinite purview in which the moral dimension, which is almost like the abyss of hell, which is being held open um, by this cultural bubble of proto-fascist uh, miscreants and cohorts of essentially people who believe in the infinite depth of that moral dimension as essentially fulfilling the promise that we are the rockets pointed at the stars, we are billions of beautiful hearts, uh, and you sold us down the river too far. You see that's the line that is part of the song, which makes it a lie. So it's a weird kind of love that maketh a lie, that it promises all this brightness and tenderness and caring, but it is all come tied with a lie that makes it a pack of lies, in fact, and makes the whole thing essentially proto-fascist garbage. Um, and this is what punk has come to mean, because essentially, I guess, uh, Pink's definition of punk, I guess, was always just to be defiant with whatever seems to be at least the wrong side or something like that, is to be edgy against the side that's wrong and not to actually see your own values. And essentially, I mean, this version of punk has no self conception. It is like I mean, I'll bring out this video after talking about my model of development to some degree and talking about, let's say, the healthy induction into juvenile adolescence and the development of the unconscious side of the mind, and how essentially I think that this fascistic sort of creed makes it impossible to ever have an independent unconscious side of the mind that's properly capable of individuating, that it gets um, it gets baked into a worldly narrative, a worldly arena in which that the time and space and place that that conforms to becomes the medium and the source of moral consideration, that the moral consideration is not independently, individually contended from an internal locus of control. It is without. The individual has without it the moral dimension, and normative morality is displaced and substituted for by an objective morality of consciousness, of identity consciousness. And the identity is this overlord that, again, is beyond and outside the individual, that the individual is without. and in need of being sold by an identity monger, by a siren call of the latest. The problem is that these siren calls for punk, for whatever you want to call it, they can only excuse themselves by reacting to an oppressor or a perpetrator or an evil. Is that when you are given these messages beyond yourself, without the direct purview of the individual that is yoking itself to this collective enterprise, you need a glue that binds you together. You need a common enemy, you need a scapegoat. And in some sense, if you don't entrench that within the culture, um, if you don't normalize it, or so, and this is what we're dealing with, is that the Democrats have been using this dark political power for, I think, about, well, it comes in cycles, but it's been around for a long time. And this form of unconscious politics has, I mean, I would say that it is the one flaw in the American structure, and in some sense, it is, the door is left open to this kind of cultural corruption, because in my arguments that I have against the American legal tradition and legal system, in that it is without the rule of law. The American legal system is deeply entrenched in the rule of man and not the rule of law. But that's a complicated separate argument that I'm not going to repeat in this recording. But essentially, most countries, even Western countries, do not properly have the rule of law. There's only one country that I believe in the history of the world that has actually properly had the rule of law, and essentially we destroyed it because of institutional corruption, which essentially came because of political corruption, which was only allowed because of the cultural corruption which we basically inherited from America, that America broadcast this disgusting fascistic politics, and usually our legal system would have been able probably to fight back against the political corruption in my country, but because the political corruption is part of this cultural slide into proto-fascism and normalizing fascist politics and the fascist arena, instead, we probably, the only functioning institutions that can probably tell us the truth are ones that are not touched by ideological observance of the reinterpretation and betrayal of constitutional values and constitutional provisions in the Bill of Rights, all of which have been completely overridden by the identity consciousness and the reinterpretation and betrayal of the Constitution. But the ordinarily, the academics with their race and gender studies, they would have been charged with constitutional damages. They, at the very least, would not be capable of receiving any public funds for their anti-constitutional propaganda, and and essentially they have normalized fascistic politics, all under basically a bunk theory of sociological, moral nihilism in some sense. There's a huge sort of amoral drive within this kind of sociological reduction, which completely overlooks liberal values. It is a paradigm in which values themselves are reduced into sociological constructs and a sociological reduction, which is, quite frankly, academic independence, or whatever it's called, academic liberty, does not trump the supreme constitution and its supreme values, which is because the constitution does have a normative morality weaved into it. And just because your section of philosophy, of social philosophy, of sociology, leads you to creating half-baked concepts like social justice, which reinterpret the Constitution and deride it and undercut it, and give judges the excuse to reinterpret the values of the Constitution and the wording of the Constitution so as to endorse a governmental prerogative which does essentially not exist in the way in which it does in American law, but which that form of American jurisprudence has been imported into our country in order to solidify this institutionalized corruption, whereas individual citizens would have ordinarily had the ability to challenge the policy of the state and the form of law as unconstitutional, because it is unconstitutional. This kind of affirmative action, which is overtly racialist, which overtly does not facilitate transformation and progress, which is used essentially as the legal means in which corruption and state looting is facilitated as well. It was very simple. Essentially, you just had to not have racialist-minded opportunism and identity consciousness flourish in the new South Africa. But because we have not done that, we have essentially had no growth, while also allowing politicians to centralize and license and de facto get their hands into everything. And sort of make provisionings and suppliers, there's this horrible sort of incentive for sort of these black middlemen that add nothing but essentially create holding companies that purchase things from overseas and resell them locally, so that big corporations can say that they have a black supplier, and that premium is passed on to the consumer, or is burdened by the big corporate. I mean, it's like racialist welfare or something like that, but for the rich. So you get these people who essentially add nothing to the economy, except extract money at the cost of the consumer. And it's interesting that this is also a kind of an economic version of what happens in liberal politics, is that everyone wants more money. They want to increase the minimum wage and such. Whereas ordinarily, the dividend that you would have in a free functioning economy and society is that you wouldn't be paid more, but the things that you bought would cost less. Prices would come down. And that never happens in this fudged economic disaster zone, essentially, where the cost of business is always increased. It's never decreased, because there isn't healthy competition, because there's too much. The current problem in South Africa is that essentially you can't be a well-functioning local business. Because essentially most of the labor market has got this racialist component to it, which means that people are headhunting for black professionals, and that means that if you give someone experience, then as soon as they have that experience, you can't retain them. And small businesses not being able to retain their workforce is incredibly disruptive. I mean, big businesses, it's easier for them probably because all the roles in their business are more specialized and pigeonholed or something like that. So you're more capable of replacing functionaries. Whereas in small businesses, people are fulfilling niche roles, and they're the kind of experience that they're getting is blended and slightly mixed. And so as soon as you train someone up for the job, then they start being productive at it. No sooner have they been headhunted by a big corporation who's trying to fulfill a quota. And so the disruption, the ultra, basically it's hard enough just to have a successful business, but now you have to play racial accounting essentially. And there's a special premium on black labor because of the racial accounting, because of the affirmative action. And so basically, labor is not reflective of market value, it's reflective of racial mandates and racial politics. And this has been one of the major causes as to why essentially there is no growth in the South African economy, is because the small and medium business sector is where all growth happens. And that is where South Africa is basically what's anemic. And it's the reason why it's anemic is because of the racialist politics around labor, which has this horrible counterproductive effect of stopping growth and stopping the emergence of job development. And sadly, this is all recycled as essentially the conspiracy that white people are destroying the economy when it's actually the government's policy. And in some sense, this is also the cover, the racialist cover needed in order to keep the other racialist policy intact, which facilitates wholesale corruption through the state, because essentially the state will only do business with black companies, and when it does business with black companies, it's allowed to pay them 1.5 to 2 times more of the contract price, depending on the level of black ownership that they have. So it's basically the corruption is in the law, is baked into the law. The looting of the state is literally based on identity politics. And when you have this kind of identity politics of being broadcast from America, normalizing this kind of and helping to disguise this kind of proto-fascist style of politics, and then essentially, it doubles down that whenever it fails, it says, well, the reason why we failed is because our scapegoat has subverted us. The conspiracy is real. The systemic oppression is real, and never mind. You just kind of ignore all the black millionaires and billionaires that have been enriched by this kind of ineffectual, inefficient mismanagement of resources that make it impossible to grow an economy and to grow jobs. And so essentially, it has been the betrayal of liberal values all along. Um, and obviously, it doesn't help then when you have these kinds of these cultural uh, powerhouses in the media, these elites who essentially virtue signal on the level of identity politics because it's a simple solution. The sentiment seems genuinely held by people because it's a genuine narcissistic injury that has been carefully calibrated and cultivated. And in some sense, I mean, this is the source of the neo-feudalism. I mean, if you want to see who to blame for neo-feudalism, I don't blame the plutocrats. I don't blame the oligarchs. I blame the proximate cause of these things. And I think it's very important to blame the proximate cause of these things. It's the journalists who have been captured by these academics, by these race-baiting academics of their race and gender studies. It's this false, pretentious academic intellectual class that has been the vanguard of this neo-feudalism, and their solution, their divisive politics and their divisive it's a kind of anti-consciousness. It's like, oh, well, we have to believe that the political arena is there for us to elect the overlord of the whose project it is to infantilize the citizenry into identity consciousness, and we should just be enthralled with our sentimental attachment to our identities and narcissistically tracking how much power and pride our identities have so that we can convert whatever envy we have in our life, we can convert it into jealousy that it was stolen from our identity. So individual envy can get passed off and fraudulently converted into identarian jealousy. And that becomes the substitution of a developed unconscious side of the mind. That becomes a substitution of normative morality. You have instead a kind of collective, I don't mean this in a disparaging way, because this is somewhat it's on some level, perhaps I shouldn't even just say it to get into the issue, but essentially, because this is not the same as individual homosexuality, but there is a kind of collective homosexuality that is happening here, which I would say, when I say collective, I mean also categorical homosexuality, in that you are creating a thematic worldview of caste and class, and as a class, you are contrasting and positioning a collective identity against another collective identity, and that we should all love the same it's so sort of abstract because it's homosexuality on a weird kind of plane, and sorry, I want to tie this into borderline personality disorder, because I do think that there is a kind of abrogating the sexual drive into an abstract, thematic, categorical obsession and fixation is, I think, characteristic of borderline, and also why borderline has certain presentations of hypersexuality. And anyway, this is sort of the wrong kind of recording to have these sorts of things in. But I would say that this is what happens when you have sexuality which is driven from parent functions, especially the higher parent functions, which are being essentially that are themselves sort of elected as the primary powerhouse within the psychological architecture and structure that you have. I haven't even made recordings specifically talking about the ego function, parent function, and the unconscious parent function. That then, I have made only slight mention of it. That then, what I see it doing is that it controls the parent function in the subconscious. That you have essentially these involuted secondary and tertiary parent functions that are then going backwards and puppeteering and puppet mastering what is actually the primary parent function. So that they're running their parent functions in reverse. And it's very interesting as well, because I would just say that also the parent function in general has a general thematic. Sorry, now I'm segueing into. Anyway, I'm going to start psychologizing just to finish this point, just because it's a useful point. But it makes sense that essentially the actual architecture and structure of personality style and of psychological schemas is fundamentally lopsided. It is fundamentally uh, it is fundamentally pathological, and it does need to, or at least many of its presentations, if it's not just merely a developmental stage, but it is actually a recurring psychopathology, a pattern of arrested development. Um, that's how I would talk about the false ego complex, is that essentially there is a way to kind of positively develop through the false ego complex, but that essentially psychopathology uh, will either be of a naive variety, that it's a kind of naive psychopathology that can be sort of a teething process of development, um, but then there are other orders of personality disorder, essentially, in which you have a recurring pathological pattern of habitual. Um, anyway, so going specifically into um, touching on the subject, is that it makes sense then that because there are some recurring features that human beings have to deal with. One is which is that biologically we need at least two people to procreate, to make and these things are gendered, so or biologically uh, you need a man and a woman essentially to reproduce the species. So it would make sense that within certain cultural spheres that there will be themes around developmental but also psychopathology which will be gender role specialized, essentially, because if if the false ego complex is prone to psychopathology of many different, or at least two varieties that I mentioned, naive but also recurring. Um, and if one of the requisites that you have to fill within a culture is that you need to facilitate pair bonding at the very least, um, then it would make sense that within a certain culture that you would get specialized psychopathology that would be complementary on some level, at least psychopathologies that would confer a pro-social effect. And I would say that, I mean, this is just a fancy way of me saying that it seems to me, generally speaking, that in most societies and most cultures, women have become facilitated and permitted and allowed to cultivate towards parent functions very early on, even. And boys and men and males are usually cultivated or encouraged to just kind of be a dominant function. Uh, and I mean, I believe in a kind of hermetical alchemy, so I believe that it's important to kind of do both, but just as the kind of default setting, that is kind of set up, and perhaps it's also set up in order to maximize um, political maneuvering in terms of sexual coupling, because if people can stick to their typecast gender role, then that will give both sexes over time the optimum opportunity to choose their mates. If people can fit the bill of the basic default rubric or something like that. And anyway, I think that these cultural themes and trends uh, are perhaps one of the reasons. Obviously, the biological alternative explanation would just be hormones, as to why women have a much higher rate of presentation of borderline personality disorder. Uh, Obviously, there are still men that have borderline personality disorder, but by and large, it's much more women. But anyway, the point here is that I think that the even women that don't have borderline personality disorder, um, on average, women are more gravitated towards developing their parent functions, especially their upper parent functions, and keeping their primary parent function in their subconscious, keeping that under wraps, repressing it, swallowing it in some sense. That and some women, I think, do pull off an integrated sense of self, where they are quite keenly um, playing off the one parent function off the other parent function as almost gates of diplomacy, and sort of revolving between them in a kind of elegant way is almost like the kind of perhaps the gold standard of feminine uh, mastery and uh, prowess or something like that. Anyway, and in some sense, these gates of diplomacy actually always represent the primary parent function in the subconscious as being the the starting position, and essentially I'm slightly contradicting myself perhaps, but essentially it's almost as if um, the primary parent function is is the primary vehicle, is the primary and essentially the other parent functions are like constellating social masks and almost revolving around the woman like moons. And if those moons line up uh, in front of her face, so that she shares with you a fully integrated um, line of parent functions, then essentially uh, that means that the gravity the of sort of of her parental energy um, is at its full uh, exposure, and that um, essentially is the epitome of what feminine energy um, she has to potentially donate to a you know I'm describing this through the filter of gender roles and the stereotypical and uh, women, I think, often retreat to the pure parental function because essentially if you express the parental function, which in common MBTI language is made up of the subconscious doesn't have a particular name. The unconscious parent function is called the critic, um, and the ego parent function is called the creative function. Um, those are the other words of parent essentially, but uh, it it doesn't ever show any potential vulnerability because the parent function at its core is always a luxury in some sense. It's always an additive expression. It always comes after the boredom of the dominant function. So in some sense, it's looking for something to do. It's looking for something to be adjunct to. And so it never has to, if it doesn't show the dominant function, it never has any skin in the game. It never has a bet that it can lose or something like that. So in some sense, it requires somebody else, almost by induction, to bring to bear and provide on the table some kind of dominant role so that the parent function has substance and mass upon which to creatively or critically involve itself to. This is also why female attention is, I think, in most cultures generally regarded as something of a slightly of a sort of a sacred thing, and why, you know, sort of teenage boys are so you know, who in some sense, boys at a young age are um, expected and even culturally entrained by the females around them in order to freely um, make their dominant roles and dominant functions accessible to female inspection, essentially, so that women can interact and engage without participating and potentially being accountable or responsible. So, you know, this is the female valence, you know, in a nutshell. Um, you know, I've often thought that there's the fame. I mean, there's a reason why this line is famous, which is "What do women want?" and you know, what is the answer? And cynically, you know, the answer would be, well, women don't know what they want, but they want attention. Is kind of like the is sadly the kind of the averaged out sort of, you know, that they are fine with going with the flow. They love going with the flow, but at any point that it feels strange or weird, or that social norms aren't being uh, you know, that after the context precipitates, like they won't be responsible for helping to generate a context which they find unpleasant. At the point at which it feels unpleasant, uh, then, you know, and this all comes from essentially having an undeveloped dominant function and having an overdeveloped parent function, which parasitically requires somebody else to provide a dominant function around which to contextualize and constellate. And this is interesting. I mean, this is also why women often uh, get mesmerized, because they, um, or potentially, where essentially they will constellate around someone, and then they will, when I say constellate, I mean almost hypothetically, and I don't mean that in a slavish sense, but they will orientate themselves. They'll essentially, being in the presence of somebody else's dominant function, or let's say masculine energy or something like that, they will know themselves through that association to some degree. They will see how they like the exercise of their parent functions. And then, you know, this is why, uh, you know, women will often try to get multiple men to chase them simultaneously so that they can actually create a choice for themselves, in some sense, by abrogating the dominant role and dominant functions that are being modeled to them by all these different men, and in some sense using that as the source matter in order to work out what the best choice is, or something like that. And in some sense, there is also no stable best choice, because all these things are contingent on things that are almost statistical in terms of, if you're just representing a parent function, and you don't commit yourself to developing a dominant function, or at least expressing it in a stable way in which you have a stable unconscious side of the mind, which um, we are constantly amplifying, at least normalizing in culture presently, um, the collectivization of that kind of accountability, and even that no one is even expected to self-evaluate and reality check themselves. You don't. It's almost normalized that you should not have to reality check anything, because that would be potentially blaming the victim, or that would be having to develop a dominant function, whereas somehow the society itself should come bearing with it a dominant function, and in some sense that dominant function comes in its current form as essentially the systemic oppression supplied by men, or by male privilege, or something like that. It's essentially concocted through a mythology, um, and then you just need to find someone to stick the tail uh, on the donkey tail onto, in order to make that modus operandi function. But essentially, um, you have an unstable feminine energy, which is now so lazy that it doesn't want to orientate itself um, towards actually, because at least in the actual sexual dance, if I could call it that, in the actual courtship, there was, at least women would hurt themselves, I would say, is that they would get drunk on male attention, and they would play around too much, and then they would be essentially uh, labeled as I don't know, as essentially, as a kind of social manipulator, as a kind of sort of in the business of some kind of witchcraft, essentially, um, cultivating um, false pretenses, and essentially uh, trying to maximize extraction of male dominant function, or male energy, but then essentially lying, because they have such a weak uh, developed side of their own dominant function, that they and in some sense what I'm describing is usually a healthy process of individuation, that women do actually need to grow um, and mature in relation to having their characters judged by men, or at least because at least when I mean, at least under the current sort of set of stereotypes, that the only way to grow a dominant function is to be abrasively handled by a dominant function for not having your own comportment of a dominant function. And so, I would say, generally speaking, the most um, psychologically stable woman would generally be of the variety of the tomboy, or at least perhaps not in I mean, obviously I'm trying to use a stereotype just to make the point, but maybe not explicitly a tomboy, but someone who was essentially a non-sexist, a non-sexualist, a woman who played with boys and girls, didn't perhaps uh, didn't like the whole female cabal sort of thing, in which people are endlessly playing with dolls just in order to model manipulative anyway, this gets a bit sloppy making these kinds of wild general remarks just to try to make a point, but essentially, women or girls that had a more mixed socialization, um, in which uh, they weren't treated differently, or at least you could say that differently. I mean, probably the biggest sort of problem with playing with girls, um, is if the peer group is of the same age. Um, the general problem is that, the physical dimorphism in terms of that boys have more energy and are stronger essentially. Um, and so I would say that you generally need a high integrity culture, which is something probably missing at a very young age. It's very hard to find incredibly high integrity 2-year olds. Um, and in some sense, the images that we have of our peers at even such a young developmental age, um, become the valences, become the creatures that our psychological schemas are designed to orientate, towards and in relation to. And so you are already sort of, anyway. So I would say that perhaps it is even something of a defense mechanism that women who are girls who are on average smaller and slightly weaker, uh, that they instead gravitate towards developing their parent functions. I also think that, I mean, hormones can't be overlooked in this. Uh, very very young boys have more testosterone in them per, blood volume than adolescent boys going through puberty. And that huge dose of testosterone not only has a huge effect on the brain and the physiology, but it also has, um, I think there is something about uh, the dominant function and testosterone, which also leads to the difference in learning styles, on average between boys and girls, in that boys are uh, gravitated towards outside scenes, um, almost spontaneously. Uh, Boys, when playing, will play with trains and cars, sort of engineering type scenarios that are outside, and girls will play with doll houses and figurines, indoor scenes between social dynamics. Um, so anyway, yeah. So I think the explanation that it's simply a an individuated coping mechanism between the difference in stature between boys and girls, which I don't think is actually that different. That although boys might have more energy, I don't know at what age. I mean, if anything, height is more a function of specific. I mean, it also varies so much, that if someone is 6 months older than somebody else, at a certain age, they'll likely be taller. But there's also quite a huge variety on that level as well. So anyway, and in some sense, it seems that yeah, it would be more to do with hormones than to do with actual physical stature. I mean, I remember growing up that the biggest problem with children, at least in my peer group, was it had nothing to do with height. It had nothing to do with strength. It had to do with just pure aggression. That especially some of the smaller boys uh, were just, quite frankly, excessively dangerous. Uh, yeah, in some sense, they had very short fuses, but not only did they have very short fuses, but they had some kind of survival strategy which included a kind of scorched earth policy so as to uh, feel secure and safe, that their boundaries would be respected, or something like that. Um, almost like tantrum strategies. But I mean, I'm talking very young. Um, anyway, and a lot of those things might not really, I mean, these are things that I think are biologically connected with the hypothalamus, and also, just generally, uh, some people will be more relaxed than other people based on their capacity to perhaps feel in charge in relation to their feeling of general capability. They're, in some sense, people that have more mental resources to solve problems at a very young age can find alternative ways to cope with problems, whereas other people are trying to sort of ward off the problems. Um, because their sense of reality and stable sort of interaction is more precariously formulated, and therefore requires a more active sort of preemptive defense mechanism. Anyway, uh, and in some sense, it does seem that like a woman's focused development on parent functions is based on redirecting that kind of social maneuvering and manipulation. That essentially, if you have actors in the world who are thus enculturated or self-developed or whatever, who who are like these creatures who have these particular identities and characters that can be modeled externally, and then they are always going to be seemingly self-directed, but in a very reactive sense. It allows them to be repositioned externally from people who can merely be like constellating parent functions that can orientate themselves towards magnetically inducing and aligning Um, so in some sense, women can use their influence to, in the same way that valence electrons dictate the characteristic of chemical bonding and chemical properties. That essentially all the properties of every atom are essentially defined by um, the shape and orbitals of its uh, valent electrons. But anyway, okay. So my whole point in going into this gender stuff is just to say essentially that apart from my sophomoric, sort of introspection into some of these stereotypes, but it's just to make the point that the parent function, or that it makes sense that each sex would have a particular domain in order to maximize pair bonding. And in some sense, this might also be part of the engine of the specialization within our species, the psychological specialization that went hand in hand with the other forms of specialization, which have perhaps also left a mark on our biology. But that it also makes sense that psychodynamically, that because we all have a false ego complex, it's necessary to balance and orientate, um, and we can, through specialization and through social um, collaboration, uh, we can create syntheses which are um, potentially very almost as if producing a serial computer by having plugged in. It is almost interesting as well that essentially, because the parent functions, especially the higher parent functions of the unconscious and the ego, represent the essentially the last gates of development. That in some sense, women orientating themselves around parent functions and men orientating themselves around dominant functions create something of a mystery forest within society, in which you, just through the filter of gender, through the concepts, and or through seeing, let's say, the psychoactive energies, um, the alchemical themes of things, very young children can see within the specialization, they can imprint on the sophistication, they can see it expressly, that if we didn't have this specialization and we didn't have a large swath, a large contingent of people, what I'm just trying to say is that if everyone was hermetically developed into the perfect synthesis of masculine and feminine, that I don't know if young children would be able to understand, would be able to navigate uh, their own psychology without the exemplar, without the illustration of the specialization. And so there is something to be said also that women themselves, in this dichotomy that I've set up, that they are more orientated around their parent functions, actually represent the final alchemical um, stage of development quite heavily, uh, because as women have this power of having these aligned parent functions, um, they quite clearly represent um, the ego, and the part of the ego which is the most uh, the greatest challenge of for an integrated synthesis of self and self actualization. And I mean, many women themselves create. In some sense, I do think many women are. I mean, this is why the stereotype that women should not get in politics, because they were seen as morally pure, that they were considered to be a cut above other people, or at least above men. I think that the reason why that stereotype persists is because of their um, accentuation and focus on parent functions. They end up seeing the crux of the human condition much more quickly, and they can work to resolve it within their own individual self, in some sense, because they see the problem of the parent function in the ego, and they can overcome it in terms of themselves. And I do think that many women, and more commonly the stereotype of a woman having an integrated Keegan stage 4, a systematized normative morality. I mean, sort of famously, Nancy Reagan, um, uh, Margaret Thatcher, uh, it's very interesting that you have, oh, I mean, there are even modern examples of this, I would say, uh, exemplar human beings that have an integrated sense of personability and high intellectual minded cohesion and cogency. Camille, I'm so bad at pronouncing names. Pagielli. I can't do better than that. Uh, Let me think. I'm so bad with names, but well, I mean, Candace Owens. It's perhaps a little. I mean, when people are so young, it's almost it's you. It almost feels bad to talk about someone's character sort of before they are quite staunchly middle aged, because then you sort of know that they've kind of they have, the developmental process in human beings, I do believe, is incredibly long. It's much longer. I do think that people are not fully grown in their character, sort of well into perhaps their very late 20s, early early 30s. Anyway, uh, that is perhaps if they constantly are growing and are not merely stuck in. I mean, I think there are some people that essentially have the same psychological schema that they had when they were sort of 22, and then that's them for the rest of their life, and it's sort of like a video game. But it is interesting, because we certainly do live in interesting times in which, I think through the culture war, uh, it's a huge sort of window into psychology for many people, but also um, issues that have been masked. It's always been surprising to me how identity politics was so ironic in all of its rhetoric. You know, all the things that it complains about are things that it wants to entrench for itself, and in some way, it's exactly what manipulative women have done in all ages, um, in terms of their weird kind of sympathy social constructivism. Creating social constructs that had a basic sympathetic module and component that was part of a kind of web of narrative within which they could operate very, very um, sophisticatedly in a very mechanical, maniacal sort of, you know, that if you hit any one of those nodes, then you were plottable within the web, and then you could be extracted from at will, essentially. Um, I was just interrupted, so I'm not sure where I was, but I wanted to get into talking about essentially, therefore, that women can often develop, let's say, something that I think is basically the archetypal work of the crucifixion, because being focused on the parent function, uh, they can precipitate what I've called in other recordings the red pulvis solaris, which is the general solution to the ego function parent, which is something like the epitome of the fault of it becomes the collection of the toxicity of the full false ego complex, becomes culminated in the parent function. And essentially, the shadow that that casts is on the inferior function. And so, if women, generally speaking, can see the synthesis that is possible in the inferior function, and they can take that upon themselves, then they basically they can see the work of the crucifixion. Essentially, they can live in the crucifixion. They can live in their inferior function. They can live through the vindication of their inferior function. And that gives them a perspective that goes beyond their own toxicity. In some sense, the only thing that might not be well known is essentially the development of the superego dominant function. That essentially, when you are living in the inferior function of your ego, you are, in an embodied way, in a self actualized way, you are taking responsibility for your whole false ego complex. You are able to see the problem of the false ego complex. Um, Now, usually what stops people from doing this is essentially the ego's almost correct perspective that it's not the ego's fault. It's an emergent property, or usually they can't even see that it's an emergent property. They will essentially project ownership of the inferior function as being imposed on by others. That essentially the invalidation of the inferior function um, is because other people are creating confusion, other people are creating drama that is causing the inferior function to be felt by the ego. And so other people are abusing the inferior function. Whereas if you regard that essentially that this is in some sense this is a property of your false ego complex. It's not a property of the world, but your false ego complex is the world, is part of the world. And so it's an emergent property that is collectively owned in some way, but it can never be resolved on the level of the collective. It can only be resolved if you take responsibility for your own ego. if the self becomes responsible for the world as the only begotten Son of God, essentially. So that's where the Christian archetype comes in, the mind of Christ, the Christ consciousness, which is explicitly explained in 1 John chapter 4, if you read the King James Version, and not one of the horribly mangled versions, but also chapter 5, 1 John chapter 4 and chapter 5. Anyway, but so in living in the inferior function, you become dead to sin by taking on the burden, taking on the accountability for your inferior function, on the inferior function. That is, taking responsibility for what the parent function is doing. And when you do that, now that is something that I see women doing sometimes. The problem is with that is that unless, and I do think that if you do the work of the crucifixion, it invariably leads to the development of the New Jerusalem. I don't, that perhaps it doesn't if you don't know how it's happening. If you don't see it as something like the crucifixion, if you don't see it something that you are willfully doing to yourself, if you just end up enacting it, but not actually participating in the crucifixion yourself with your sense of responsibility, then you don't die to the sin of the ego that is precipitated as the consequence of the inferior function. That if you don't own the inferior function by yourself, 100% belongs to you, then the sin doesn't get negated. And if the sin is negated relative to the inferior function, then the inferior function is a candidate for resurrection. And what that essentially means is that what I think it means is that it will precipitate the development of a dominant function in the superego. 3 days in the grave. I must say, maybe my model is slightly speculative. Maybe I should put a caveat that I'm not sure if the first day is the day of the crucifixion itself. Because if the inferior function is the thing to be resurrected, if the inferior function is the only thing that is truly alive, then the sin itself is already dead. So the sin is the first day. The sin is also the death of the superego. So counting that as the first day, then the child function in the superego would be the second day, and then you're still dead. And then the third day will be the vanity, or the dominant function of the superego. And so resurrected on the third day. Or if my counting is wrong, and you don't count the sin as the first day in the grave, then that means that the resurrection would be on the parent function. That the parent function would be where the resurrection takes place. Now that, maybe I should look at that again. Because I always said that, oh no, the New Jerusalem is the dominant function in the superego. In doing that, it ends up trying to concoct a new personality in a completely different structure. Perhaps it would be better to create a new personality out of the same structure, exactly the same structure, just under a different order. And if that is correct, then I am wrong about the sin being the first day in the grave. Then it's the child function, the dominant function, and then the first day is the parent function, which becomes the New Jerusalem. Now, that changes. Anyway, I mean, so that would just be an alternative model of self-actualization that would make it more tangible, because instead of trying to undercut the false prophet, then you are trying to establish the New Jerusalem in its place. That would certainly make it more visceral, doing war against the false prophet directly, rather than trying to first surround it by the dominant function of the superego and creating that new thing. Well, maybe both are true. It's just that now I'm at the stage of self-actualization in which this is the second round, where the first round is the establishment of the dominant function. The second round is the actual final besiege of the false prophet to reclaim the tree of life. So that's the other thing, is that both are true, and that there is also, I believe, reference to this in the book of Revelations, where there is a staggered development where the beast is even preserved to do war against the city of God one last time, and then holy fire comes. Is that, in some sense, there are two battles before the war is won. Anyway, so I mean, it does make sense that before I was focused on trying to establish a model of the solution, which is perhaps still the development of the red pulver solaris, and then the last thing is the actual cleansing and catharsis of the parent function in the superego. Yeah, that makes. I mean, I guess this could have been, but yeah, again, focusing on the parent function. Yeah, that is really where the problem is. I'm just trying to think if it's possible to just focus on the parent function in the superego to solve the problem. And I think that in some sense, that is it perhaps a proto-New Jerusalem in the dimension before it, in the dominant function before it, as using it as an abstract lever, as a stepping stone to mounting up the full outline of the false prophet, to understand the full, in some sense, as an organizing principle. I just need to. You see, the only problem here is that if I'm counting incorrectly or something like that, then it might be wrong. It hypothetically, it might be wrong to use that undercutting dominant function. But I think, because even when you use it as a stepping stone, it doesn't actually seem to be used that overtly. It's used very, very indirectly. So even if it does conflict with the 3 days in the grave in some degree, it might still be supported from the other parts in the scripture. I mean, really just in conceptualizing the field of battle itself. Because obviously the dominant function in the superego, even if it is always dead and you're meant to be asleep in the grave, it is still the place in which the city of God and the beast are jointly in the same universe, on the same paradigm, in the same plane. they occupy the same space in that slightly obtuse. So in some sense, it might just help ground um, the field of battle, as it were. Um, to be a kind of breakwater between the death in the grave, or being asleep in the grave, and the burgeoning new life and new personality that needs to sort of surround the cancer or surround something. Surround the false prophet. Anyway, I'm speaking quite badly now, but yeah, I just wanted. It's probably good that I indulged in going into this psychological sort of thing. At least there'll be some record of my development and thought around these models of psychology. Anyway.